So our topic today is a general topic that can also be a pun if we're talking about the locomotive, but it's not really a drill down, dig deep down topic, but I know this stuff pretty good, and if you have questions that go into more detail than I go into, I'll be happy to do so. Now, I will give you the good news up front. This should take about an hour, so I know it's posted as 2 to 4. And if you're thinking, oh my God, he's going to talk for 2 hours, and I am not. So I think with questions and whatnot, I should go to about 3. So other than Virginia, and we all know about the Civil War activity in Virginia. It's where Lee fought the general of the day in the early part of the war. It's where Lee and Grant fought in 1864 and 1865. But Georgia is probably the second most important theater of the war, because in 1864 and 1865, well, Sherman invades it in 1864. It goes through the state. And we'll talk about that in some detail. And then when he's done, he moves on into the Carolinas, then Georgia is invaded a second time in 1865 by Wilson's raid coming in from Alabama. So there's actually quite a lot going on in Georgia that maybe not everybody is aware of. So the main thing we'll talk about is a great locomotive chase, which I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I hear you had Mike Schaefer in here recently who talked about it. So I'll just go over that quickly. But we'll spend more time on the Battle of Chickamauga, which is like the 3rd biggest battle in history in North America. You know, Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga. Sherman's Atlanta campaign, which is Sherman's invasion of northern Georgia. Sherman's march to the sea, which may be the single most famous incident of the whole war, is his march to the sea. And then we'll talk about Wilson's raid, which is the one that happened in 1865. So I always have to have some sort of tagline for my presentations. I think the Civil War was won or lost, depending what side you represent, in Georgia. Because if Sherman hadn't been successful in taking Georgia in 1864, it's possible the South could have held on. So, a great locomotive chase. Mike Schaefer didn't have this, so I'll talk about this. This is a piece of Western and Atlantic script, so the railroad that the chase happened on. And it's dated April 1862. So I have an important story to tell you to start off. Guys, these were like, you could buy drinks and whatnot with this kind of script. You know how the old amusement parks you'd go to and you'd buy 10 tickets and you'd have to spend 7 of them to go on a ride. Like that. So I read that this guy had found a whole chest full of these in his grandmother's attic. And he ran an antique store in Kingston. So he's going to sell these. So I went up there and I found the box and I started going through. And I took out all the April 1862 ones, every one of them. It was 12 or 13. I took them up and he rang them up and he said, well, why'd you buy all the April 1862 ones? And I said, because that's when the Great Locomotive Chase was. And he went, so that meant now I had them all and he didn't. So anyway, that should bring you up to date on the Andrews raid. Happened on April 12th, 1862. 20 Union spies led by a civilian. Probably wouldn't happen today. Unless you consider the CIA civilian. I guess the raid to get Osama bin Laden, that's CIA people involved. Seized the locomotive general at Big Shanty, Georgia, which today, of course, is known as Kennesaw. The train had stopped for a 20-minute breakfast break at the Lacey Hotel, and this is pretty much what it probably looked like. A better idea what the Lacey looked like, if you ever been up to Alatoona Pass, you know, you go around that big bend, there's a house there. And the Lacey Hotel was supposedly built on the plan of that house. So that house should look pretty much like the Lacey. The objective of stealing the train is steamed to Chattanooga, burn bridges, tearing up track, heading telegraph wire along the way, which is a great idea, and it was supposed to be in conjunction with a Union move on Chattanooga. Problem is, they were a day late. Now, that's the story of my life, day late, dollar short. But with them, it's really true. It's a day late. And the day before, when they were supposed to steal the train, you know, the sun was out, and there were angelic hosts in the sky telling them, steal the train, you'll be successful. But the day they steal the train, the next day, it's pouring rain. So what are bridges made of back then? Wood. How successful are you going to be burning wooden bridges in a rainstorm? So the fact that it was a day late, it made them unsuccessful. They were pursued by Captain William Fuller and the guy who's in charge of locomotives on the Western Atlantic Railroad. And the second guy becomes important, Anthony Murphy, because they confiscated a couple of locomotives along the way to chase the general. And since he was in charge of all the locomotives in the Western Atlantic, he could say, I'll take that one. And then they did. The reason this has kind of become famous isn't because it had some great strategic significance. It didn't. If they'd done it the day before, it might have, but they didn't. But Fuller pursued by foot, hand car, and 3 different locomotives, the most famous of which is the Texas. Now, the hand car, everybody thinks it's the kind from the Buster Keaton movie where they do this, and it's not. It's just a platform on wheels, and you would pole it along like you're in Venice on the canals. But that's why it became famous, because this guy chased them for 87 miles, 3 different locomotives and the others. So the results, the Raiders abandoned a train at Ringgold. They got close to Chattanooga, but no cigar. Heavy rains, bridges don't burn. And because of the close pursuit of Fuller and Murphy on the Texas, they were not able to blow up the Tunnel Hill Tunnel. Now, I've always heard they were going to blow up the Tunnel Hill Tunnel, but they didn't have any explosives with it. So I've always been puzzled how they were going to blow it up. Now, I think maybe what they would have done if they'd had time is they had some box cars behind them. Maybe they would have tried to derail one of the box cars that would block the tunnel. But either way, they didn't have the chance. So the raid is a total failure. 2 miles north of Ringgold, Andrews, who is a civilian, he's not trained militarily. So Andrews says, every man for himself. So everybody jumps off and they run off into the distance. Now, the guys chasing them, there's like 6 or 7 of them. And Andrews had 20, and they were all armed. So if he had been a military man, he might have ambushed them and continued on his way. But he wasn't, and they were all captured. 8 of them were hung, including Andrews. Bunch are buried at Chattanooga National Cemetery. 8 escaped and made it back to Union lines. 6 were involved in a prisoner exchange. 20 of the 22 original military members of the raid received the Congressional Medal of Honor, or I will say, to be correct, the Medal of Honor. Congressional is an adjective. It's actually just the Medal of Honor. So this is where the Medal of Honor came from. It was to thank these guys for the raid. Now, poor Andrews, he's a civilian. So did he get one of the Medals of Honor? And back then, what do they call it today? The Presidential Medal of Freedom. Like Bob Dylan received one, and Lauren Bacall, and people like that get one. Well, they didn't have that back then. So poor Andrews gets killed, he gets hung, and he's never rewarded. General is still at the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History. And the Texas, this is an old picture. This is when it was at the Cyclorama in Grant Park. It is now all shined up, and it's at the Atlanta History Center. Okay, I told you I was going to go through that quick, and now we'll go a little slower, maybe a little more detail. So the Battle of Chickamauga is one of those battles that nobody thinks about. I mean, if I went around the room before we started this presentation and I said, name the most famous battle or series of battles in Georgia. And I bet most of you would name either Sherman's invasion, the Atlanta campaign, or you would name the Martian Sea. And nobody thinks about Chickamauga. Well, Chickamauga, like I said, it's the third biggest battle in North America in history. So it really was an extraordinary battle. And it could have been a turning point in the war, except that the Confederate General Bragg, anybody here directly descended from Braxton Bragg? Okay, moving on. Bragg chose not to pursue the Yankees after he kicked them out of Chickamauga. And so it really was kind of a draw. So Chickamauga occurs September 19th to 20th, 1863. Braxton Bragg leads the Confederates. William Rosecrans leads the Union Army. And it's called Chickamauga because it occurs at along Chickamauga Creek in northern Georgia. And I love this painting because in the late 1880s, a series of paintings of famous Civil War battles was commissioned. And the guy that did them, he was great. I mean, look at the detail of the soldiers. Isn't that fantastic? The problem is, he'd never been to the battlefield. This looks like these cliffs here. I've hiked that battlefield 25 times. There's no cliffs there. The highest you get above Chickamauga Creek is maybe a little hill like this. And my favorite one is the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, because it looks like the Matterhorn in the background, not Kennesaw Mountain.
It is a Matterhorn.
But they're very colorful, very detailed. These are not two of the best generals of the war between the states. Matter of fact, perhaps they were two of the worst generals of the war. Now, Bragg was known for having a terrific advantage on the first day of every battle he fought in, and then getting his backside whipped on the second day. It kind of didn't exactly happen that way in Chickamauga when it was close. Now, Rosecrans has this great moment in the Tullahoma campaign. And he wins the Tullahoma campaign. And he thinks that every northern newspaper is going to have headlines like this: Rosecrans hero wins Tullahoma campaign. The problem was the timing. It happened the day of Gettysburg and the day after Vicksburg. So it was like page 7 under the fold. So I only kind of felt sorry for him. So Chickamauga, I know you probably can't see this real well. The snaky thing is the creek, and I mentioned there's no cliffs overlooking it. And the red is the Confederate Army. The blue is the Union Army. And this is what it looked like kind of at the end of the first day. Now, this part right here, this looks like the Union Army is surrounded, but it's not really, because this is it's called Snodgrass Hill. It's way up. So yeah, they're kind of surrounded, but you have to charge up the hill to get to them.
How high above the plain was
Pardon?
Snodgrass? How high above the plain was Snodgrass Hill? I've never been.
1,500 feet,
How much?
maybe 1,500.
Really?
Maybe. It's fairly high.
So was the Union Army to the south then?
Union Army was to the west. Confederate Army was to the east. So that's the basic map. Day 1 includes a Twilight attack by Patrick Cleburne, who's probably the best divisional commander of the whole war. Why he was never made a corps commander or an army commander is a question we will probably never know the answer to. But he makes an attack at twilight on day 1 against George Thomas's position on Snodgrass Hill. Cleburne's forces captured 300 prisoners and a mile of ground. So it actually changed the whole complexion of the battlefield at the end of day 1. So day 2, a couple interesting things happened. James Longstreet, we usually associate him with Lee. He's one of Lee's corps commanders. Well, Lee sent him down to help Braxton Bragg. And for the first time in history, a whole corps is transferred by railroad And 23,000 of his men are shipped down by railroad, and the last of them arrived the morning of the second day of the battle. This is what you might call just-in-time arrival in a battle, and it's something brand new in warfare. It never happened before. Can you imagine if Napoleon had the ability to shift his army around that way? So this is something new. Now, it took 3 weeks. Why did it take 3 weeks? Was he taking Amtrak or something? I know, that's unfair. I actually enjoy Amtrak. But why did it take so long? Because the Confederate railway system, well, some of the gauges were 5 feet. This is the distance between the rails. And some of them were 4 feet, 8.5, and some of them were narrow gauge. So the soldiers would be trundling along, and they'd get to the end of Railroad A. They'd all have to get off, walk to cars on Railroad B, and get back in. So it takes 3 weeks for him to get there. But nobody else has ever done this before. So Bragg had set up a series of attacks. And Leonidas Polk was the right wing, and he attacked first. And by the way, we could argue for the next week about whether it's pronounced Leonidas or Leonidas. I go with Leonidas because how many of you know who ate beers is?
Who what?
Or Ed Bars, I'm sorry. Ed Bars, how many of you know who Ed Bars is? Okay, see if you know from this. Ken Burns' Civil War. Well, Civil War was fought on 10,000 battlefields. And that's the way he talks all the time. I was at his 90th birthday party. And if you say hello to him, he goes, hello! So anyway, he says that he's talked to his descendants of the family and that it was pronounced Leonidas. So I'm sticking with Ed Bars because he talked so cool. So anyway, earlier in the morning, Leonidas Polk attacks. Not much happens. Next, it's Longstreet's turn to attack. Now, while Longstreet is preparing his 23,000 men to attack, Rosecrans, who I mentioned isn't a very good general, did I mention that? He's got all his troops in the middle of his line moving here and there and up and down and all around. And at the moment that Longstreet attacks, there's no one in the Union Center. There's literally no one there. There's crickets. There's cricket sounds. So this is the point Longstreet attacked. 23,000 men. Bam! Right through the middle of the Union line. Totally rolls up the Union right. And that would have been the end of the battle, except remember, Snodgrass Hill, George Thomas is still way up there on Snodgrass Hill. So he probably doesn't even know this happened. But the rest of the Union Army, in a presentation I have that's just on Chickamauga, the slide's called Run Away, Run Away, like in a Monty Python movie. Half the Union Army runs away to Chattanooga, including their commander. Rosecrans goes with them and leaves Thomas by himself on Snodgrass Hill. It's amazing. But this is probably the most famous frontal attack, or the most successful frontal attack since Richard the Lionheart at Arsuf in the Third Crusade. I mean, it's just stunningly successful. And this is probably Longstreet's greatest moment as a general. 5 Union divisions, including Rosecrans, retreat to Chattanooga. But George Thomas is still there on Snodgrass Hill. This is Brotherton Cabin. It's still on the battlefield. When Longstreet attacked, troops would have gone on both sides of that cabin. And the guys that were living there were sitting out front on a bench, and they watched the attack. The armies went around. They waved to the soldiers as they went. So, Snodgrass Hill, Thomas is still up there with half the Union Army. Longstreet later said in his autobiography, we launched 25 attacks on Snodgrass Hill, and we couldn't dislodge George Thomas. Finally, when it was night, Thomas retreated, and he too went up to Chattanooga. Now, here's the key to the whole battle. Bragg failed to pursue the retreating Federal Army. Here he had just won this amazing victory, but he didn't pursue them. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was a corps commander, he was a cavalry corps commander during this battle. He later threatened to kill Bragg because he said Bragg was a coward that he didn't pursue. And he actually said to Bragg, and this is pretty famous, "Why do you bother fighting at all?" Now, Forrest was a general, but he was a subordinate to Bragg at that point. So it got pretty heated. This is the key. Bragg fails to pursue. And this is what Snodgrass Hill looks like today, by the way. So George Thomas, the Northern Press, instead of saying Rosecrans gets his clock cleaned at Chickamauga, now it's all George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. Isn't that? And that's almost as good as Stonewall Jackson, isn't it? If you're going to have a nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. And that's how people would say it. Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce to you General George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. And that's how they'd say it. If not for Thomas, the Union Army under Rosecrans probably would have been destroyed. So, I think it was a draw. There's actually more Southern casualties than Northern casualties. But if Bragg had pursued up to Chattanooga, it might have been a different story. Okay, so that's a two-day battle.
May I comment on Bragg? As I recall reading, one reason he stayed in his position, he was Jeff Davis's buddy. They knew each other, were close friends. And Davis had a tendency to...
John Bell Hood was buddies with Jeff Davis too, and neither case did it work out well for the Confederacy. Anybody here directly descended from John Bell Hood? So I'm at this presentation one time in Cumming, Georgia, and I wasn't speaking. Speakers up there said, the worst general in the whole war was John Bell Hood. He was terrible. And South lost because of John Bell Hood. He was the devil. He was a demon. And when he's finally done, a guy stood up in the middle of the room and said, everyone around me is a direct descendant of John Bell Hood. Oh, boy, was that entertaining. And I'm glad it wasn't me up there. Okay, we move to the next biggie, which is Sherman's invasion. So Sherman and Lincoln and Grant had all got together, and they decided, here's how we're going to win the war. Grant's going to defeat Lee's army. Easier said than done. Sherman's going to attack Georgia. So why is Sherman going to attack Georgia? It's the transportation capital, Deep South. It's the breadbasket of the Deep South. And it's one of the manufacturing centers, the big powder works in Augusta. Smoke Dock's still there. So it's a really important place. So they figured if Sherman was going to take Georgia, and if Grant could defeat Lee in Virginia, the war would be over. So what eventually happened? Sherman took Georgia and the Carolinas, and Grant defeated Lee, and that was the end of the war. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of our story because a couple things have to happen first. The Atlanta campaign starts on May 6, 1864, where Sherman brings about 110,000 troops down to Ringgold in northern Georgia. Campaign ends on September 2nd, 1864, when Atlanta, Georgia falls to his troops. The Confederates swap commanding officers in the middle of all this. They start out with Joe Johnston. They end up with John Bell Hood. I'm not going to say anything further about it all. Why was Atlanta important? Supply and transportation hub of the whole Deep South. And it had these railroads radiating out from it. All the railroads came together in Atlanta. The Western Atlantic, the Georgia, the Macon and Western, and the Atlanta and West Point. By the way, you know East Point in Atlanta? It's called East Point because the railroad went to West Point, so they thought, well, we ought to have an East Point. So that's what they named the station in Atlanta. So Sherman has over 100,000, it's probably about 110. And Joe Johnston has 74,000. And that doesn't sound like that big a disparity. But here's the problem from the point of view of the Confederacy. Every Confederate soldier who's killed is not replaced. They're gone. That's it. Sherman's army actually got bigger as the Atlanta campaign went on, because the Irish were coming over here en masse. They'd get off in New York City, and there'd be recruiters for the Union Army, and they'd say, so you want free room and board and a free uniform, and you get a free gun? Sign me up. So they'd sign up the Irish, and they'd take a train down. Next thing you know, they were in Sherman's Army. So Sherman's army kept getting bigger, which usually doesn't work this way during an invasion, and the Confederate army kept getting smaller. Why I thought it was important to note how many ambulances Sherman had in an overview of the Atlanta campaign, I have no idea. But now you know. As I said, Sherman faced two Confederate commanders. There's Johnston, there's Hood. I will say one thing about the two of them. Johnston was noted as being a defensive genius. Hood was known as, attack! Attack! So, the first part of the battle through northern Georgia, Johnston is the guy in charge. And the defense of Atlanta, Hood is the guy in charge. If you're going to have swap them, it should have been the other way around. It should have been Hood in northern Georgia. It should have been Johnston in Atlanta. Anyway, they didn't ask me. So, it's going to be hard to do this without saying mean things about John Bell Hood. A group of battles fought in northern Georgia. And if you look at the casualty numbers, here's Union, here's Confederate. Well, looks like Confederates won Resaca by a pretty good margin. Oh, they sure won New Hope Church. They sure won Pickett's Mill. They sure won Kennesaw Mountain. So if the Confederates won all the battles, how come Sherman won the war? Because after every battle, Sherman would flank Johnston, and he would keep heading toward Atlanta. He didn't care. Oh, golly, I lost the battle of Resaca, woo-hoo. And then he would just move on, and then Johnston would have to pull back. But remember these casualty numbers, because we're going to compare them to John Bell Hood in a moment. Here's some of the things left at some of those battlefields. There's this wonderful old house that was Sherman's headquarters in northern Georgia at Tunnel Hill. It was in private hands for a long time, and the Whitfield County Tourist Bureau had been trying to buy it. But the couple that lived there got a divorce, and the divorce went on forever. For years, the divorce went on. So the house is just up in the air while the divorce is being settled. Well, finally, they got divorced. Like the next day, the woman sold the house to the Whitfield County Tourist Bureau, and then that was that. The Confederate Cemetery at Resaca is round. So if you've ever seen The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and they had that round cemetery at the end, it really happened during the war. There's about a 500-acre part of the battlefield that is now a state park. So that's new within the last 2 years or so. And there's hiking areas and whatnot. This is Dug Gap. You can get an idea what the terrain was like. And this is Cassville, where one of the battles was. Monument at New Hope Church. Here's the Illinois monument at Kennesaw Mountain. And here's a monument at Pine Mountain to Leonidas Polk. Now, again, this probably isn't necessary for an overview, but it's kind of sad. So Hardee and Johnston and Polk are standing on the top of Pine Mountain. And Hardee and Johnston are fairly slimmer than me. Polk is 2 of me. And Sherman has his binoculars, or his glass. And he said, look at them, how brazen they are. They're just standing out there. Lob a few shells their way. Hardee and Johnston are. And Polk took one right in the belly. And that was the end of Leonidas Polk. And there's this wonderful monument. It's on Fred Bentley Sr.'s property. And he doesn't mind if people go see it, but it's not on public property. Now we move to Atlanta. So Sherman finally gets to North Georgia. He comes down here. Johnston has this huge defensive line here along the Chattahoochee. So Sherman does what he always does. Anybody want to guess? Goes around him, like he always does. Sherman's mama didn't raise no fool. He's not going to try to go through this defensive line. So he crosses the river over here at Soap Creek. And there's a series of significant battles. Now I can't explain this without being negative about John Bell Hood. I'm sorry. So remember how in North Georgia, Johnston won every battle? Okay, now look at Union versus Confederate casualties. Now John Bell Hood's ahead of the Union, or ahead of the Confederate Army. 1,800 to 2,500 Union to Confederate. 3,700 to 7,000 Battle of Atlanta. Ezra Church 600 Union to 3,000 Confederate. And Jonesboro 1,450 Union casualties to 3,100. Almost from the minute that John Bell Hood takes over as the commander, the Confederate fortunes go down. Familiar with the Peter Principle? The higher you're promoted, the more you're promoted until you reach your level of incompetence. That's John Bell Hood. Guy's a hero at Gettysburg. He's a great division commander, great corps commander, and they put him in charge of the army. Okay, what's left today? Tanner Park along Peachtree Creek in Atlanta is still there. There's a marker where McPherson, one of Sherman's Army commanders, was killed. There was a whole ring of forts, barricades around Atlanta. It was the most heavily fortified city in the world at that point. And the only fort that's still left is in the southeastern corner of Grant Park. And it's Fort Walker. And there you see plenty. And lying to the South Monument and Oakland Cemetery, and there's some other monuments there also. Now, of course, this one particularly is controversial. These two not quite as much. But there's controversy about this.
What kind of controversy?
It's lauding the Confederate dead. There are 5 Works Progress Administration kiosks along Sherman's route. And the last one is at Ezra Church, and it is still there today. There's a Confederate cemetery at Utoy Church. There's 17 graves there. This is the Warren House in Jonesboro. It was used as a headquarters. It was used as a hospital. And it's in better shape than it was when I took this picture. It's actually been fixed up. And then, of course, the mill ruins, Sweetwater Creek State Park, destroyed in 1864, and they've been sitting there like that ever since. So Sherman takes Atlanta, September 2nd. He's not there real long, because that's only half his objective. The original plan with Grant is he's going to take Atlanta, and then he's going to march across the center part of Georgia and take Savannah. So Sherman decides, he makes a fateful decision. Sherman went to West Point. And every teacher he had at West Point said, your army is your supply line. Logistics, logistics, logistics. You know, in real estate, they say, location, location, location. They told him at West Point, logistics, logistics, logistics. Never get ahead of your supply line. So what does Sherman do? He blows up his supply line, which is the Western Atlantic Railroad. 12 miles of it he destroys. And then he marches on Savannah. So he literally has no supply line when he starts marching on Savannah. Now this does behoove him to want to get to Savannah pretty quick because there are Union ships waiting in Savannah off the coast that have supplies for him. So that does give them an incentive to get there as quickly as possible. But this is probably the most famous movement of the war, his march to the sea. Let's see, the New York Times called it the grandest episode of the war. Now, if you're on the Confederate side, you might not view it that way. But he did, he actually had, this kind of looks like it was a straight, here's Savannah. He actually had two wings. He had a right wing and a left wing, and one kind of went down by Macon, and the other one by Milledgeville, and then they met and marched to Savannah. He did the whole thing in 5.5 weeks. Marched from Atlanta to Savannah, 5.5 weeks. Had 62,000 troops split into two wings. So where's the other 60,000 that he had when he took North Georgia? Hood has taken his army into Tennessee. Sherman sends George Thomas, the Rock, of Chickamauga, after him with half of his army. So Thomas has 60,000 men. He's going to beat Hood at Spring Hill, at Franklin, and of course the coup d'etat, the final battle at Nashville. So Sherman's got about 62,000, which doesn't sound like much, but the only opposition to Sherman along that whole route is Joe Wheeler's cavalry, which is around 5,000. Joe Wheeler was a great cavalry guy, but against Sherman's main army, 62,000 guys, all he could do was annoy Sherman. He couldn't stop him. Much of the infrastructure in central Georgia was destroyed. We talked about the 4 railroads that went into Atlanta, Western Atlantic, Georgia, and Atlanta and West Point, whatnot. The one railroad he didn't get was the Central Railroad because it ran from Macon to Savannah. So he's got one of his wings comes down to the Central Railroad, and they just march along the Central Railroad, destroying it. I mean, they burned down the stations, the roundhouses. They just destroyed everything on the poor Central Railroad. And here's the two wings. Here's the Atlanta one coming down near Macon, and here's the northern one coming through Milledgeville. And it was a stunningly successful movement. So what did it accomplish? Not everybody agrees with me on what I say here, and you're allowed to disagree with me, but please wait till we're done, and then I'll leave a period for rebuttals. I think this is actually more important to the outcome of the war than his invasion of northern Georgia was. Because it dealt a blow to the morale of the Confederacy that the Confederacy never recovered from. If you talk to people who've had families that have lived in this area for 160, 170 years, and you get them talking about Sherman, are they going to talk about the Battle of Resaca? They're going to talk about the March to the Sea and the fact that he destroyed so much of the infrastructure. So this really had an impact on the Confederacy. The most important railroad in central Georgia is just devastated. The few Confederate forces still left in Georgia are split in half because they didn't know where Sherman was going. Is he going to Macon? Is he going to Savannah? Is he going to Augusta? Augusta would be a good target because it had the big powder works there, right? So they didn't know where he was, so their forces were split in half. So he takes Savannah a little over a month, and Atlanta campaign took 4 months to cover half the distance. Of course, it helps when you don't have any opposition. I bet even I could have led the Union Army on that.
Even Hood feel that.
Good news from Georgia, helped President Lincoln be reelected after Atlanta was taken. He defeats George McClellan with 55% of the vote. And the reason Lincoln won re-election is because the Union Army, see, even back then they had absentee votes and, and they had to wait to count the votes. The Union Army went for Lincoln like 85%, and that's why he won re-election. After taking Savannah, Sherman turns north to march to the Carolinas, and now we're coming to the denouement of his and Grant's plan. Because now Sherman's coming up from the south to the Carolinas, Grant's up here, he's got Lee tied up at Petersburg, and the goal is that Sherman's going to come in behind Lee at Petersburg. And that was the original plan. Stuff left today. The Indian Spring Hotel. Some of the Union soldiers, when they saw that hotel sitting here, they said, well, this is where we're staying tonight. So they got the sleeping sheets and all that stuff. There's 209 Confederate dead in the cemetery in Forsyth. And the reason there's so many is because there was a Confederate hospital there. Kate Cumming wrote a book about her time as a Confederate nurse, and she spent a whole chapter on Forsyth. This is my wife. She wasn't there during the actual battle, but this is Griswoldville Battlefield, which was a clash between Kilpatrick's Union cavalry and Wheeler's Confederate cavalry. They clashed there, and then they both retreated. And then a guy named General Pleasonton.
T-O-N on the end of Pleasanton?
No, it was actually Pleasant. Like, oh, it's so Pleasant. Pleasant Jackson, who was a militia commander and had no experience like actually fighting. He led 4,000 16-year-old boys onto the battlefield at Griswoldville, and there was this big flat plain, and it's a swamp, and there's creeks going through it. And then the Union Army is up on the heights, and they're dug in, and they have repeating rifles, you know, like the John Wayne, Henry, Spencer repeating rifles. And he tells them to charge, so they charge across this open swamp, and they're just devastated. And that night when the Union soldiers went out to see if there's any wounded, they were stunned. You see, these are 15-year-old, 16-year-old kids. They were stunned. So anyway, that's Griswoldville. There's now a obelisk there too. That's new since I took this picture. But it never hurts to have a picture of your wife in your presentations. It's a tip if you ever decide to do this. Nancy knows my point.
Yes.
Confederate artillery battery at the Riverside Cemetery in Macon, Georgia. There's those two big cemeteries in northern Macon. And this fort is actually inside the cemetery. And you can be buried inside the fort, which is kind of cool. I think I'd like that. This is not the cemetery where Dwayne Allman's buried. Anybody know?
Rose Hill.
Yeah, Rose Hill's where Dwayne Allman's buried, which is right up the hill from this. The old governor's mansion in Milledgeville is still there. Joseph Brown got out of Dodge before Sherman's troops got there. I'm out of here, Jack. This wonderful store outside of Social Circle was built in 1821, and it's still there today. It's so cool. And I did a presentation similar to this to the Covington Historical Society. And I had no idea that they now administered that store. And so I'm up there and I'm talking about this stuff, and they started applauding. I said, well, why are you applauding? I mean, other than, you know, I know it's probably a fantastic presentation. But what are you applauding for? Well, because you have our store. Yeah, I planned that. And the old state capitol, Milledgeville, that's still there also. Buckhead Church in Millen, Georgia is still there today. They still hold occasional services there. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's in such good shape. This is Fort McAllister. Sherman viewed that if he could take Fort McAllister, which is south of Savannah, that Hardee would have to surrender Savannah. He sends William Hazen, to attack this fort. He takes it in 15 minutes, and 48 hours later, the Confederates had evacuated Savannah, and Sherman marched in. This is Fort Jackson, the interior line of defense. This is Savannah. It is still there today. This is Camp Millen, which was where one of the big prisoner of war camps was. When Sherman was getting closer to Macon, the South shipped everybody out of Andersonville to Millen, and then Sherman starts getting close to Millen, and they shipped everybody out to South Carolina. For a long time, this is the military camp there. For a long time, nobody knew where the actual prisoner of war camp was. And about 6 years ago, an archaeological team from, I think, Savannah, they found the old prisoner of war camp. And we're on the last part. So Sherman takes Savannah. He's there for less than a month. And then he starts on his march to the Carolinas. And his march to the Carolinas is as tough as the march to the sea. But for some reason, I think march to the sea has a certain public relations ring to it. It's like the Rock of Chickamauga. Whereas the march to the Carolinas doesn't have that kind of ring to it, so we tend to talk about the march to the sea. So we now move to 1865 and the end of the war. Major General James Wilson, Union cavalry commander, destroys the industrial and mining infrastructure of Alabama in March and April of 1865. Believe it or not, Alabama, the central part of it, was full of mines, coal mines, iron mines, and the huge naval armaments facility in Selma was there, and Wilson just came down and destroyed all of that. Now, depending where you're from, whether you're from Texas, or you're from Alabama, or you're from Georgia, the last battle of the Civil War occurred in one of those three places. Depending on which one you're from is which one you'll vote for. This is Georgia. Ergo, the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Georgia. April 16th, 1865. Now notice, Lincoln's assassinated 2 days before. Lee surrendered 7 days before. War's over. But they hadn't heard about it here yet. They didn't have, text message. Oh, by the way, it's over. You might as well go home. So on April 16th, Wilson's cavalry under Colonel Oscar Hugh LaGrange captures Fort Tyler at West Point. And I think I have a picture of Fort Tyler next. If not, I'll describe it. Now that's in the afternoon. In the evening, Wilson himself leads a force that storms across the bridges of the Chattahoochee, and they take Columbus, Georgia. And Columbus, Georgia, there's a huge iron factory there. And they almost had completed a new ironclad for the Confederacy. And Wilson's troops sank it. And it's since been raised, and it's in the National Civil War Naval Museum. You can see it. So these are the last two battles of the Civil War. If you want to get technical about it, this is the very last one because it happened in the evening. This one happened in the afternoon. The other one, I can understand the Texas one, because the Texas one happened in May, for Pete's sakes. I mean, as bad as the communications was with Georgia, it's like Texas is on the lunar surface or something. So they actually had a battle in Texas in May. So the war's over, Confederacy surrendered, yada, yada, yada. I don't include that one, although if I was from Texas, I would. Now, the Alabama one's stupid. It happened like 3 days before this, so I'm not even going to mention that. It doesn't deserve my mention. This is Fort Tyler and West Point, as it appears today, which is pretty cool. It's open, doesn't cost anything to go there. You climb up a path, and then there's a bridge that goes into the fort itself. And the thing that's cool about this fort, in something like 1905, City of West Point built a reservoir, and this ended up at the bottom of the reservoir. So the mid-90s come around, they don't need the reservoir anymore. So they drain all the water out of it. And guess what? The fort's still there, it's still standing. So it's been fixed up, and you can visit there today. The guy who was the head of the Confederates there said that he would not live to see the Yankees control Georgia, and he did not. He was killed in the fight. Couple others to mention, and then I'll open it to questions, comments, and rebuttals. So if any of you secretly are directly descended from John Bell Hood, I guess now is when we'll hear about it. But just a couple other things before we get to that. Wilson is also the one that liberated Macon, or Andersonville, I'm sorry. He also liberated Macon, but Macon surrendered, because by that time they knew that Lee had surrendered. And he's the one that marched in and took the powder works in Augusta. But there was no battle there. The war was over when he took it. So he's kind of the end show, I guess. Union Army boots Joe Brown out of the governorship and puts in some guy they like. And this is before Reconstruction starts. They've already kicked out the Georgia governor and put in some other guy. But then eventually Reconstruction starts. Georgia is under a military rule during... I will leave you with one very important thought. Please buy my books, and thank you for coming today.